I am Emily Lopez, and I was still rubbing the sting on my cheek when the lawyer leaned forward and looked straight at my mother. The entire dining room froze, over 30 relatives holding their breath, because no one had ever cut her off like that. But in that moment, nothing else mattered except his low, calm words. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Like you were only invited to the table, so they could decide which part of you to carve up next? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The air in the grand dining room of our Napa Valley estate usually smelled of expensive oak-aged Cabernet and old money. Today, it smelled of ozone and cold, calculated betrayal. My skin was still buzzing from the impact of my mother's love. Jennifer had always been a woman of precise strikes, but this was the first time she had done it in front of the entire extended clan. I didn't pull away. I didn't cry. I didn't even give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Instead, I stood there, letting the silence settle over the 30 relatives gathered for our annual autumn feast like a heavy, suffocating fog. My sister, Victoria, sat to my left. She was 32, polished to a high sheen, and currently vibrating with a greed so intense I could almost taste it. She had just slammed a leather-bound folder onto the mahogany table. Inside was the deed to this property, the crown jewel of the valley, valued at $15.6 million. Sign it, Emily. Victoria hissed, her voice cutting through the quiet. Sign the deed over to me right now. Ryan's investment firm is facing a temporary liquidity crisis, and this estate is the only collateral that can save our family's reputation. You're never even here. You're too busy playing with your little camera in New York and London to care about what happens to this land. I looked at her. I looked at the tailored suit she wore, bought with a credit line I had quietly paid off 3 months ago. I looked at our mother, Jennifer, whose face was flushed with a terrifying righteous anger. To them, I wasn't a daughter or a sister. I was an asset. I was the silent investor who had been footing the bill for their lifestyle while I built my own career as an architectural photographer. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdraft for years. But today, the account was empty. I'm not signing anything, I said. My voice was clinical. It wasn't loud, but it stopped the murmuring cousins at the far end of the table and said, "This vineyard doesn't belong to that family in the way you think it does. And it certainly doesn't belong to Ryan's gambling debts." That was when the second blow came. Not a physical one, but the weight of my mother's voice. "You have no choice, Emily," Jennifer whispered, leaning in so close I could see the reflection of the chandelier in her cold eyes. "You've always been the outsider. We let you chase your little dreams while Victoria stayed here and held things together. You owe us this. Do what you're told, or you are no longer part of this name." I felt the prison without bars tightening around my chest, that familiar, heavy chain of obligation they had used to keep me small for 28 years. But then Samuel stood up. Samuel had been my grandfather's lawyer for 4 decades. He was 62, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked as ironclad as his reputation. He didn't look at the relatives. He didn't look at the crying aunts or the smirking cousins. He looked directly at my mother, who was still standing over me like a judge. "Jennifer," Samuel said, his voice dropping into a register that commanded absolute authority, "I suggest you sit down and lower your hand." My mother scoffed, a sharp, entitled sound. "This is a private family matter, Samuel. My daughter is being difficult about her inheritance." Samuel didn't blink. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick notarized binder. "That's where you're mistaken," he whispered, just loud enough for every ear in the room to catch. "Do you even know who the real owner of this $15.6 million estate actually is?" Grandpa had included a strict non-disclosure clause in the trust, keeping the ownership transition sealed until the estate's liquidity was threatened by outside debts. The room went dead. The sound of a silver fork hitting a china plate echoed like a gunshot. My mother's hand froze midair. Victoria's smug expression didn't just fade. It curdled. They looked at Samuel. Then they looked at the binder. And finally, with a slow, creeping dread, they turned their eyes back to me. Samuel cleared his throat, the sound magnified by the sudden lack of breathing in the room. The trust was updated 15 years ago, he stated, flipping to a page bearing my grandfather's unmistakable, bold signature. And as of this moment, Emily isn't just a beneficiary. She is the sole absolute owner of the vineyard, the trust, and every single cent of the $4.5 million cash reserve. I didn't smile. I didn't feel a rush of hate. I just felt a cold, sharp clarity. This wasn't a family dinner anymore. It wasn't accounting, which means I said, looking directly at the sister who had just tried to rob me, that as of 12:03 p.m., everyone in this room is a guest on my property. And I've decided the party is over. It was the sound of a 15.6 million dream shattering into a million jagged pieces. I watched the blood drain from Victoria's face until she looked like a marble statue of greed. My mother, Jennifer, was still leaning forward, her eyes wide, searching for a lie in Samuel's gaze. She found none. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for them to understand. I just looked at Samuel and gave the only instruction that mattered. Samuel, the corporate accounts, and the estate-funded credit lines, the ones tied to the vineyard's cash reserve. I want them frozen immediately. That includes the supplementary cards issued to Victoria and Ryan. Victoria finally found her voice, but it was shrill, desperate. You can't do that. Emily Ryan has payments due on the investment portfolio by Monday. You'll ruin us. I stood up, adjusting my blazer. The movement was slow, deliberate. I'm not ruining you, Victoria. I'm just stopping the subscription. I've been the silent investor in your version of family for too long, and I've decided not to renew. People often wonder why I stayed silent for so long, why I allowed them to treat me like a backup plan while I quietly funded their failures. It was the invisible chain of the survivor. I grew up in a house where my only value was my utility. I learned to be the fixer, the one who didn't make noise, because noise was dangerous. I was living in a prison without bars, where the walls were built of guilt and the bars were made of family duty. For 28 years, I was just trying to survive their expectations, hoping that if I gave enough, maybe one day I would finally belong. But standing there, I realized something. You can never give enough to people who only see you as a resource. I walked past the 30 relatives who were now whispering in terrified tones. I didn't head for the front door. I went to the small display case in the library. Inside was a vintage camera lens, an original glass piece that had belonged to my father. It was the only thing in this house that wasn't a transaction. I felt the cold weight of the metal in my hand, a tangible piece of a legacy they hadn't managed to sell yet. "What are you doing?" my mother shouted, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and entitlement. "You can't just walk out. We have to fix this. We have to talk about Ryan's debts." I turned at the doorway, the lens tucked safely into my bag. I didn't feel anger. I felt a clinical sharp clarity. There's nothing left to fix, Jennifer. This isn't a breakdown. It's a balance sheet, and the balance is zero. I walked out into the Napa fog, the gravel of the driveway crunching under my boots. The first sound of a freedom that had cost me 28 years of silence. Behind me, I could hear the shouting start, the frantic calls to bankers. the beginning of a collapse that had been inevitable from the moment they decided my worth was something they could negotiate. I got into my car, the silence of the cabin wrapping around me like a shield. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. The accounting had officially begun. Samuel met me at a quiet bistro in downtown Napa. An hour later, the air was clear here, away from the toxic fumes of the estate. He placed a heavy black ledger on the table. He told me that while they thought I was just lucky, luck didn't pay the property taxes for the last 36 months. I did. I opened the ledger, and the numbers were staggering. While Victoria was charging $5,000 shopping sprees to the estate account, I had been quietly transferring my photography commissions, $200,000 a year, to cover the vineyard's overhead. My family hadn't been managing the estate. They had been cannibalizing it. For 3 years, I had been the silent architect of their survival, paying for the very ground they stood on. While they spat on my name, I sat back, the realization chilling me. I wondered why I did it for so long. It was because in my family, cruelty had been normalized. When a mother treats her child as an interest-bearing account for decades, you stop seeing the abuse for what it is. You start seeing it as the cost of entry. Jennifer didn't hate me because I was a failure. She hated me because I was the only part of her life she couldn't fully liquidate. In her world, love was a commodity, and since I was the one producing the value, I was the one she had to keep under her thumb. It was the trap of normalized cruelty. In families like mine, the predators don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as entitled managers of your labor. They aren't shocked by their own greed. They are genuinely offended that the utility is no longer functional. Samuel prompted me to look at the maintenance line. I saw it, $150,000 for a new irrigation system that didn't exist. The money had been diverted to Ryan's offshore gambling accounts. My mother had co-signed the withdrawal. She hadn't just watched them rob me. She had handed them the keys to the vault. My relationship with my mother wasn't a bond. It was a contract. I was the silent partner, and she was the CEO who had been cooking the books for years. I had been paying for a seat at a table where I was actually on the menu. I closed the ledger. With a soft final click, I told Samuel that the audit was no longer optional. I wanted a forensic accounting of every dollar that moved through the trust since Grandpa died. I wanted to see the exact moment. My mother decided my father's memory was worth less than Ryan's next bet. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. It was a balance sheet that finally made sense. I wasn't the ungrateful daughter. I was the silent investor who was finally calling in the debt. Victoria and Jennifer didn't spend the night reflecting on their actions or seeking a path toward reconciliation. Instead, they spent those hours sharpening their knives, doubling down on a cruelty that had finally lost its power over me. There was no apology for the slap. That was still burning on my cheek, and no regret for the years they had treated me as a convenient bank account. By the time the morning fog began to lift off the Napa Valley vines, Victoria had already launched a full-scale character assassination. On social media, she used her influence to post public lies about my architectural photography business, weaving a twisted narrative that I had stolen the Napa estate through elder abuse and manipulation. In her digital world, I was the predator who had preyed on our grandfather in his final days, while she was the noble protector, trying to save the family legacy from a greedy outsider. I watched the comments roll in from people who didn't know the truth, clients, colleagues, and total strangers, all judging a career I had built with my own hands. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I looked at the screen and realized that Victoria wasn't shocked by what she had done. She was simply outraged that I had stopped playing along with her game. The escalation didn't stop with public smears. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone buzzed with a final, desperate ultimatum from Jennifer. It was a text designed to cut deeper than any physical blow. She wrote, "If you don't sign that deed over to Victoria by Friday, don't bother coming to my funeral." It was the ultimate narcissistic move, weaponizing her own mortality to force my hand and guilt me back into the prison without bars she had kept me in for 28 years. I sat in my apartment, the only light coming from the glowing screen. I didn't cry, and I didn't ask why she could be so heartless. I just looked at a shattered photo frame of the three of us that had fallen off my desk earlier, the cracked glass cutting right through our smiling faces. It was a symbolic end to a relationship that I now realized had been a parasite I was forced to host. Since I was a child, Jennifer wasn't choosing Victoria. She was choosing the money she thought Victoria could provide. My compassion had been a luxury. They had overdraft for too long. They thought this was still a family dispute. They could win with threats and tears. But they were wrong. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. And as the clock ticked toward Friday, I realized something else. They were no longer just ungrateful relatives. They were liabilities I needed to liquidate. I didn't answer a single message. I went back to my spreadsheet and began preparing for the professional escalation they never saw coming. The office atmosphere at Samuel's firm was the exact opposite of the chaotic wine-soaked aggression of the Napa estate. It smelled of old leather, high-grade stationery, and the quiet, heavy weight of a fountain pen that was about to change everything. I sat across from Samuel, watching the sunlight glint off the dust moles in the air. I wasn't defending myself. I was moving from a position of emotional defense to a systematic legal defense. Samuel slid 3 documents across his oak desk. They were formal eviction notices. For years, my core family had treated the guest cottages on the $15.6 million vineyard like their personal rent-free resorts. Victoria had a cottage for her creative retreats, and Ryan used another to host his high-stakes poker buddies. They had been occupying my land while calling me an ungrateful outsider. I picked up the fountain pen. Its cold metallic weight felt solid in my hand, a tool of precision. I didn't hesitate. I signed each notice with a hand that didn't shake. 1 signature for Victoria, 1 for Ryan, 1 signature for Victoria, 1 for Ryan, 1 for the distant cousins who had cheered when my mother slapped me. I wasn't just signing papers. I was clearing the pests from my inheritance. Give them 30 days, I told Samuel. My voice was as level as a ledger line. If they aren't out by the 31st day, involve the sheriff's department. No exceptions. No extensions. Next, we initiated the forensic audit of the Vineyards Trust Fund. I had suspected for months that the temporary liquidity crisis Victoria mentioned was actually a code word for something much more criminal. As the numbers began to pull back the curtain, the stench of embezzlement became impossible to ignore. We found signs of massive cash withdrawals, hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled through shell companies, all leading back to Ryan and Victoria. They hadn't just been living off me. They had been cannibalizing the future of the estate to fund a gambling addiction that had finally run out of luck. My compassion had been the luxury. They had overdraft for years. But now I was the one doing the math. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a criminal investigation. I watched Samuel make notes, In the margins of the audit report, his face grim. Every number was a bullet. Every missing dollar was a reason never to look back. Inside the office, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. Victoria and Jennifer were waiting for a breakdown, but all they were going to get was a court date. Samuel pulled one final document from the audit folder, his face set in a line of grim professionalism. It was the kill shot we had been looking for, the piece of evidence that moved this from a family dispute to a federal crime. He laid out a loan agreement for $4,500,000, a high-interest debt secured directly against the vineyard land. I looked at the signature. At the bottom, it was my grandfather's bold, elegant script, but the date was stamped 3 days after he had fallen into his final coma. Jennifer and Victoria hadn't just been skimming the trust. They had forged a dead man's signature to leverage my future. They weren't just ungrateful. They were criminals who had treated Grandpa's legacy as a blank check. But the audit revealed a betrayal that cut even deeper than the $4,500,000. Tucked behind the loan documents, I found a series of private sales receipts from a high-end antique dealer. My breath hitched, the clinical clarity in my mind flickering. For just a second, Jennifer had sold my father's original vintage camera collection, the only tangible connection I had left to him. I stared at the numbers on the receipt. $12,000. That was the price of my father's memory. I looked at the corresponding bank transfer and saw exactly where the money went: Victoria's sorority dues and a membership initiation fee for her social club. They had liquidated my soul to pay for a social status that was as hollow as their hearts. My father's cameras, the glass and metal I had touched 1,000 times to feel close to him, had been traded for a week of parties and a silk sash. This wasn't a family dynamic. It was a systematic liquidation of everything I valued. I stared at the realization that I wasn't just the silent investor. In their version of family, I was the collateral they had been burning to keep themselves warm. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were only shocked that I had finally audited the truth. I looked at Samuel and pushed the receipts back toward him. My voice didn't shake. It was the sound of a closing door. I told him to add the forgery and the theft of personal property to the criminal complaint. I was no longer looking for an apology or an explanation. I was looking for a total settlement of the debt. The prison without bars had finally dissolved. You can't feel guilty for evicting people who have already stolen your father's ghost. This wasn't a breakdown. It was the final entry on a balance sheet that had been written in blood and betrayal for 28 years. And the balance was finally coming due. The iron gates of the Napa estate felt heavier than usual as I stood behind them, watching a dust-covered SUV pull up to the entrance. Jennifer and Victoria emerged, but they weren't the polished socialites who had mocked me at the dinner table 30 days ago. Their designer clothes were wrinkled, and their eyes were raw and red from what I assumed were hours of frantic, useless crying. Emily opened the gate. Jennifer shouted, her voice thin and cracking against the quiet of the valley. She gripped the bars, her knuckles white. The bank is at our house in Albany. They've served us with a foreclosure notice. They're taking everything. You have to talk to Samuel. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please. I'm your mother. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the remote to let them in. I just looked at them through the heavy iron bars. I realized in that moment that their power had always been a carefully constructed illusion. For years, Victoria had walked through this world with the arrogance of a queen, and Jennifer had ruled our family with the authority of a judge. But it was an empty wallet, power illusion. Their status wasn't built on character, or intelligence, or even their own hard work. It was a luxury they had leased, using my bank account as collateral the moment I stopped paying the bill. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. They weren't powerful people facing a crisis. They were empty vessels who had lost their only source of fuel. Without my money to prop up their vanity, they didn't know how to be human. They didn't know how to survive because they had spent 28 years believing that being family meant having a permanent interest-free loan on my life and my labor. Their power was never theirs. It was just my compassion that they had overdraft until the account was closed. Victoria pushed past our mother, her face contorted with a desperate, ugly rage. Ryan is going to prison. If that forgery charge sticks, Emily, is that what you want? To destroy your own sister's life over some old cameras and numbers on a ledger? I walked forward until I was only inches from the gate. I reached into my bag and pulled out 2 thick envelopes that I slid them through the bars, letting them fall to the dusty ground at their feet. Inside the first one is the final eviction notice. For the guest cottages, I said. My voice was clinical, as cold as the morning fog. Inside the second is a copy of the criminal complaint Samuel filed this morning for the $4,500,000 forged loan and the theft of my personal property. Jennifer let out a low animal wail, sinking to her knees in the gravel. How can you be so cruel? Where is your heart? Where your blood? I met her eyes, the same eyes that had watched me work double shifts to pay for my own existence, while she sold my father's memories to pay for a social club. You taught me that blood is just another word for collateral. Jennifer, I said, I already gave you 28 years of mercy. I checked my inventory this morning. I'm out of stock. I turned my back on them and walked toward the main house. Behind me, I heard the sound of the electric lock engaging. With a heavy final click, they were still screaming, still pleading, but I didn't hear them anymore. They were no longer part of the balance sheet. They were just noise in the distance. The legal battle ended with the clinical finality of the closing ledger. Their suburban house was sold at auction to restore the trust funds they had bled dry, and justice was finally served. As they faced the legal consequences of their forgery, I stood in the vineyard at dawn, my camera capturing the first golden light over the grapes Grandpa had left to me. I opened my laptop, saw a long, desperate message from Victoria, and hit delete without reading a single word. Peace is finally quiet. I placed Dad's recovered camera lens on Grandpa's old desk. 2 legacies finally safe and honored. If you believe that your personal identity matters more than the approval of toxic people, hit that share button to spread this message. Would you have given them a second chance? Or was this harvest exactly what they deserved? Let me know in the comments.